President Trump made some comments earlier today there in Scotland, where he was meeting with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer regarding the situation in Russia, these peace talks, which really do seem, I'm just going to say it, they seem like they've been stalled out. The battlefront is what it is in eastern Ukraine, in those Russian-speaking provinces. President Trump initially saying 50-day deadline, now saying 10 to 12-day deadline. We're not exactly sure what happens at the end of that. Seems like he's trying to get talks to restart. But I wanted to get your sense on what the situation really is on the ground in Ukraine and what cards the U.S., if any, really has to play here.
Well, thanks, Jack. And this is a very important question. Look, I understand why President Trump is frustrated. President Putin has not had a real incentive to move rapidly on peace talks. And that is because there is an unfortunate reality. And that is that Russia has a military, manpower, and material advantage that the West, including all of NATO, can't really overcome. And so he's not in a position right now where he feels like he really needs to stop the fighting, because he feels like he can achieve more of his military objectives over the next few months. So what does that mean? So the reality is the Russians have a 3-to-1 manpower advantage over the Ukrainians. They just simply have more people than the Ukrainians. In addition, the Ukrainian military is having a lot of problems. The people in the West like to focus on how much aid that the United States or NATO is giving Ukraine, but their biggest problem, again, comes down to manpower, is they just don't have enough people. They're having higher levels of desertions. I've read reports that there's been over 100,000 desertions already this year. Now, in fairness, some of those are guys actually deserting from one unit to another. They don't like the unit they're in, so they're going to go to a unit they think's better. But a lot of it, too, has to do with that people just don't want to be thrown in a meat grinder. So I've even seen some very pro-Ukraine voices in the last week or so acknowledge that the Ukrainian military is in really bad shape. There may be a breakdown in some of their lines, and the Russians' advances may accelerate. And so that is a really unfortunate reality. And here's the tougher pill to swallow, I think, for a lot of people in the West, is short of a direct intervention by NATO, which of course would be really dangerous and could lead to a nuclear war, there's really not a lot that we can do to fundamentally change the battlefield dynamics in Ukraine. So it's a very difficult situation. And again, I understand where President Trump's coming from. He doesn't like to see the killing. He doesn't like to see the destruction of these cities. But there's not a whole lot that we can do unless we risk nuclear war, or we do things that can hurt us economically to really change the current balance of power on the battlefield.
And not only that, but we also saw over the weekend two items, and I kind of put them in contention, because you've got the massive protests now we're seeing in Kiev and other places where they're calling out. Now, these are not anti-war protests. I want to be clear about that to everyone. But they are sort of anti-Zelensky in the sense that he has signed this new bill effectively shutting down a lot of the anti-corruption watchdog bureaus that were set up post-2014, post-Maidan within Ukraine. So he signed a new law basically shutting them down. Again, this is a guy who's been in office without an election now for a very, very long time. He was elected in 2019. So he's now been in office for 6 years. Martial law, of course, was imposed on the country due to the invasion, but he continues beyond his original term. And so that's sort of what you're starting to see blow over into this deteriorating political condition, which lines up with everything you're talking about regarding the front lines between the movement of people and troops from unit to unit, and as well as the lack of supplies. The EU just announced over the weekend, by the way, that they are going to be cutting their aid to Ukraine, I think almost $2 billion over these corruption concerns. This is certainly something that's very serious. And at the same time, on the battlefield, we were talking about this earlier in the spring. We said end of July is when you would really see Russia attempt to make a breakout along some of these lines. That's when the fighting season really kicks off. And we've got this map up that I can show of Pokrovsk, which is right there now getting squeezed as the Russians really move to envelop this key city. And, you know, people say, okay, well, what is this? We're zoomed in. If you look at all the green right there, that's exactly the spot where this late July offensive is that we predicted would come out. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer was on here. That's now happening across a key intersection for logistics in terms of a hub between the highways for pretty much all the main cities on the Eastern Front. So if they take the logistics hub, now you've got a straight shot potentially all the way back down to the river from the Dnieper, and which runs north-south, and of course is the same river on which Kiev itself sits. So Dan, when we're talking about this, those eastern cities, those really are the ones that have the most offensives. Those are the ones that really have the most built up armaments, the built up battlements. You know, the cities beyond these areas just don't really have the level of defenses that we saw in the East.
That's correct. And they started building up those defenses all the way back in 2014 during the first phase of the Donbass war. And I think this has been a mistake of the Ukrainian military, is that they have chosen to prioritize holding cities that really there's no strategic advantage to hold, like Bakhmut in 2023. That incredibly bloody battle, had they not sacrificed, potentially tens of thousands of troops in that pointless battle, their counteroffensive likely would have been more effective. And continuing to double down on these cities that they know they're going to lose in the coming months, they would make the argument as, oh, we're bleeding the Russians. But again, the Russians have more men to sacrifice. And by prioritizing these types of operations, the operation in Kursk, instead of moving back to more defensive positions, hardening up in certain areas, shortening their lines, they make these decisions that are more political in nature than based on sound military strategy. And that gets back to what you were talking about earlier about Zelensky and his political position. I think we have to be honest here. Is Zelensky and his right-hand man Yermak, who I just have to say is might as well be a Russian agent, because I think he's done more to harm Ukraine over the past couple of years than just about anybody else. They really know that they're done as soon as the war is over or there's an election. So they have an incentive to keep this going and to keep these spectacular political operations that keep some of their supporters in the West happy. But again, they really have to make some hard decisions here, shorten their lines, move to more of an active defensive strategy, and that will allow them to hold on longer and get to a place where they are in better shape in negotiations. But again, that requires acknowledging some things that will cause them to take some political blows that Zelensky and Yermak just aren't willing to do.
And of course, this is also why I think, if you see from the Russian side, they're saying if we're enveloping these key cities, if we're at the point where they might even be looking at the potential for severing Ukrainian supply lines to the east, I think they're sitting there from the perspective of saying, why should we negotiate when we're winning?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a key thing, is they have a military advantage. And I want to get back to something I said earlier. There's just simply not a lot of things the West can do to change that. There's been a lot of talk, for example, about giving Ukraine more Patriot missiles. And I think President Trump has found a way to do it effectively in the short term without undermining our own readiness. But it doesn't change the reality that the United States only produces around 600 Patriot missiles a year. The Russians produce 1,200 Iskander ballistic missiles a year. And that doesn't include their Kinzhal missiles. It doesn't include their Jarin drones, other things that at times we've used the Patriots to shoot down. That's a mathematical reality that's not going to change over the next few months. So even if we were to start surging supplies to Ukraine, you'd only buy them another few months in their current position. And that would, at the same time, completely undermine our readiness in other key theaters, mainly the Pacific and, the Middle East, where, God forbid things kick off there. We may have to expend more munitions there. So there's some mathematical realities around manpower, around the West's ability to produce things that unfortunately we just can't change. So I would just say to President Trump, the administration, I understand where you're coming from. There's some short-term things I understand you're trying to accomplish. But in the long term, this is going to ultimately end with Ukraine making some tough concessions and Russia controlling more of Ukraine, likely what they do now.